So first thing I got to cover is what's a variable and what's not a variable. So variables versus constants. So variables are qualities or quantities that vary between people, groups, or things that you are studying. So height, IQ, gross income, prior number of sexual partners, the grade level of elementary school students, etc. These are all things that vary between people groups or things that you're studying. So juxtapose that to constants. So constants are qualities or quantities that do not vary between people groups or things being studied. So they may vary, but not in your study, right? So height among people who are 5'7" for example. IQ among people who are all 130 IQ. Income among those who make $100,000 a year. Average number of sexual partners among people with 3 prior sexual partners, grade level, fifth graders, etc., and so forth. So these are all things that don't vary in the people you're studying. So if everyone in your study is a fifth grader, it's not a variable, it's a constant. So that is the key here, is that when you're looking at a study, if it's all women in the study, women's not one of the variables in the study. Okay, that is the population you're studying. It's a constant. So variables have to vary because constants cannot be independent or dependent variables. So what are these independent and dependent variables of which I speak? Well, in research, we're frequently focused on how one variable is affected, that is the DV, dependent variable, by some other variable, the IV, or independent variable. So sometimes we're looking at how one variable differs, again, that's still the DV, the thing that you're sort of measuring, by another variable, that's the independent variable. So sometimes we are we think the independent variable affects the DV. Sometimes we think the DV just differs, maybe naturally as a function of this other variable. So an independent variable is the variable that affects the other one. That would be a true independent variable. It's actually causally resulting in changes. The other type of independent variable is one that we think the DV differs by. So if we think it just differs by it but may not be causing it, we call that a quasi-independent variable. The dependent variable, on the other hand, it's the one that you think is affected by a true IV or that differs as a function of a quasi-IV. So that would be our dependent variable. We always just measure the DV. Sometimes we manipulate the IV. Sometimes we're just measuring the IV. So I added these little boxes on here about sort of what is the most important material in the course, and being able to correctly identify what's the independent variable in a study. First of all, what's a variable and what's not a variable, and secondly, so what's the independent variable in the study and what's the dependent variable in the study is really one of the top 5 most important things in the entire course. Like, you have to get this down in order to be successful. So much so that after having taught this for 20 years, I just sort of built an assignment where you will learn it by the time you're done, whether you want to or not. So coming soon. So the independent variables are the variables that we think affect the other variables or that the other variables differ as a function of. So to be a variable, it has to have at least 2 levels, right? So otherwise it's a constant. So that could be 2 levels, 2 treatments, 2 different groups. If it's all one group, it's not a variable, it's a constant, it can't be the independent variable. So there's some subtypes of independent variables. The first one, again, is what we call true independent variables. And those are independent variables that are, or at least can be, actively manipulated, assigned, or changed by the researcher in a study. So they can choose the levels, like who is what level and how are those levels defined. So drug levels, for example, attachment styles, counseling types, smoking status, these are all things that are potentially assignable in a study. Sometimes an experimental group is compared to what we call a control group. So The experimental group is a group that gets the treatment of interest. So maybe they're getting the new therapy or the new drug or whatever it is. And the control group is treated in all other ways as similarly as possible, but they do not get the treatment of interest. So frequently in our work, they get sort of the existing drug or medication for treating a particular condition. And we're trying out a new one, and that's what the experimental group gets. Control gets the old treatment, experimental gets a new one. So back in the day, less frequently now, they used to get, the control group would get something called a placebo. So a placebo is something that is given to the control group. It's innocuous, but it might even look like the actual experimental treatment. So obvious example of that would be for a study on the effects of caffeine on memory. One group gets caffeinated coffee and one group gets decaf coffee. That decaf looks exactly like the experimental treatment, but it does not have the key thing, that is the caffeine in it. So it is a placebo. So quasi-independent variables are independent variables that are not actively manipulated, assigned, or changed by the researcher in the study. So sometimes it's that they can't, sometimes it's not ethical to. So for example, participant sex, smoking behavior, their prior drug treatment, like history, all these sorts of things that you can't really assign people to smoke, right? Or you couldn't assign them to have been to drug treatment multiple times. So we think that DVs vary as a function of these variables, but the researcher either cannot or did not actively manipulate, assign, or change the levels. So sometimes you choose not to, right? Other times, if it's a true experiment, they can actually determine exactly what those levels are. That would make it a true IV. So the levels of quasi-independent variables are measured as they already exist. So that's that naturally occurring state thing. Sometimes it's because it's impossible to assign participants to the levels. So for example, you couldn't go back in time and assign someone to grow up in a household with an abusive parent. You can't go back in time and you couldn't assign their sex, their self-esteem level. These are all things that all you can do is measure what they are or ask people what they are, right? And so they are quasi-independent variables. Other times you could assign it, but you know what? It's unethical or possibly even illegal to assign it, and so you're just going to measure it. So you can't make someone start smoking, right? So you can't hold them back in school to compare folks who, were held back versus not held back. That would be probably illegal too, but unethical. You can't infect them with a disease. No, there's an awful history of that. It's not ethical to give people diseases any longer, just to watch the effects of things. So we tend to place more confidence in research in studies that had true independent variables. So like clinical trials, which are sort of the gold standard in epidemiology for drug trials, for example. They randomly assign folks to the levels of drug in large numbers, and they follow them up. And we place a lot of confidence in those results because of things you'll learn about in the course about true experiments and their control for confounding. So dependent variables are the variables that we measure because we think they're affected by other variables, or we think they differ by other variables. That is, independent variables or quasi-independent variables affect or these differ as a function of. So they're always measured. So we're always measuring them to see if the IVs had an effect or they differ between our groups. So for example, you might measure someone's coping skills level, or their crash rates, or their scores on the NEO-PI, or whether they're still sober, right? So these are all things that you measure because you think they differ as a function of some other variables. These are going to be your DVs in a study. So there are studies that have multiple IVs and multiple DVs, and so just be aware of that. So you can look, for example, on the effects of both partnering and practice, that is having a partner and practice, on both memory and mood. In this sort of short quip here, you've got 2 IVs and 2 DVs. Effects of partnering and practice, we think they affect what? Both memory and mood That's why the latter are the DVs. So let's try to apply this. And this whole note about use an IV name, not its levels, is important. So you wouldn't say, my variable was left-handed people and right-handed people. No, those are the levels of a variable called handedness, right? So you got to come up with some sort of name for the levels or categories of your variable. That's what I'm trying to say here. All right. So, does caffeine affect recall for four-letter words? Does caffeine affect recall for four-letter words? So what is the IV and what is the DV? So I would say that the independent variable is caffeine level. Like, we don't know what it is, but it probably could be a true independent variable to assign people to drink different milligrams of caffeine in different groups. Your DV is recall specifically for four-letter words. That's how it was operationally defined. Do bullied kids have lower self-esteem as adults? What's the independent variable and what's the dependent variable? And is that independent variable quasi or true? Well, the independent variable here is bullying experience, I guess. Like, you got to come up with some name. There's obviously kids who are bullied and not bullied, right? Those are the levels of some variable called what? I don't know. So I call it bullying experience. You might say history of having been bullied, right? The levels of which are yes and no, something like that. It doesn't matter as long as, honestly, your dissertation committee agrees, right? So you can look out in the literature and see what they call it. Good enough bullying experience. So the DV thing, or what do we think? Or first of all, are we randomly assigning kids to be bullied or not? No, we're measuring that. That is a quasi-independent variable. So what do we think varies as a function of whether you've been bullied or not? Well, that's your DV, and in this study, it is self-esteem. We think self-esteem functions or differs as a function of whether you were bullied or not as a kid. Here's the handed one. I already gave this one away. So do right and left-handed persons differ on income? Whoa, what's going on in this one? Everything's going to be measured in this one, right? So what are you going to call right and left-handed people? As a name, we're going to call it handedness if you're me. So it is a quasi-independent variable. We're not like smacking people with rulers and making them use their left or right hands. We are taking them how they are. So it is a quasi-independent variable. And then we're comparing the income between those who are left-handed and right-handed. So the DV is income. So that was research variables. Now let's talk about the three major types of studies. The three major types of studies are used to achieve the major goals of research that we talked about last lecture. So descriptive studies is the first type. So shocker of the semester, descriptive studies describe things. I know. So specifically, they are used to describe or summarize behaviors, groups, situations, phenomena, persons, historical records of things. And there are three major types of descriptive studies. So the first one is describing, of course, groups or persons or phenomena. So those are called case studies. So describing, for example, like in the picture there, people who dress their ponies like princesses, that might, you could do a case study of that if you were just describing this particular group or phenomena. So shoppers, you could describe gamblers, geniuses, famous politicians, cult leaders, etc. Biographies are kind of like case studies of people. Then there's archival research. So this is the analysis of records or facts, and one of my favorite types of research because you can get it done fast. So that is a plot, for example, of suicides per year. And so it's kind of interesting when different events happen and looking how numbers or rates of suicides change. But if you're analyzing records and facts, you are doing archival research. So you could also look at personal ads in the newspaper over time, kind of how they changed. Actually, used to do this in my methods class where we'd get the want ads from different time periods and sort of see what folks were offering and what it was they were looking for in their partners as a content analysis. Finally, we have naturalistic observation, which would be just sitting, watching, recording what you're seeing, and then reporting it in the real world, specifically events. So you might describe activities, for example, on social media, where you observe or you observe and describe aggression among children on a playground, or you describe the behaviors that you're seeing in a homeless camp. But the naturalistic piece of this is that you're out in the real world, so you're in nature, and you're observing things. So again, one of those titles that kind of means exactly what it sounds like it means. So the goal of all descriptive studies, including all three types, is, not surprisingly, to describe things. So the next major type of study that we do is correlational studies. And correlational studies examine relations between variables as they exist. So that's that whole as they exist in nature thing. We call those correlational studies. And they look for two different types of correlational relationships. Positive relationships, that is where the variables tend to go up or down in the same direction. So higher this, higher the other thing. Lower this, lower the other thing. So the other type of relationship is what we call negative relationships, and that's where the variables tend to move in opposite directions. As one goes up, the other one tends to go down. So for example, let's see if you can name the correlational relationship type between shark attacks and ice cream sales. Well, that is a positive relationship. When shark attacks tend to be high, ice cream sales tend to be high. When shark attacks are low, ice cream sales tend to be low. Why is that? Temperature. We talked about that sort of already with crime rates. But also, shark attacks and crime rates are apparently positively related because they're both related to temperature. So economic conditions and racism are negatively related. So when economic conditions tend to be good, that is, they're high, racism tends to be lower, and vice versa. When economic conditions are poor, racism tends to increase. How about experience and skill at a complex task? That's a positive relationship. So the more experience you have at something, your skill at something also tends to increase. So driving, for example, folks who have more experience driving tend to have more skill at driving. And most complex tasks are like that, a positive relationship. Number of bosses at work and your happiness, negative. Meaning those who tend to have more bosses, more people who are looking at your work and you're reporting to, tend to be less happy. So higher bosses, lower happiness, fewer bosses, more happiness. That's a negative relationship. And you're going to hear this 10,000 times during the course. You cannot infer causation in correlational studies. It's almost like a meme that stats professors point this out. So the goal of correlational studies, again, not surprising, is to correlate phenomena. You're trying to see how things correlate or are related. So finally, we get to experimental studies. Now, experiments systematically determine how DVs are affected or differ as a function of independent variables. And there are two different types of experimental studies. There are true experiments, and true experiments look at how DVs are affected by IVs. The point in these studies is to make causal conclusions from them. So that's an optical illusion in the upper left-hand corner. In the right corner, this is one they used to say, did you notice Godzilla is also in the picture? So there's Godzilla in that picture in the background. Bet you didn't notice. All true experiments have all true independent variables. That is, independent variables that are manipulated, assigned, or changed by the researcher. That's what makes a true experiment. You can infer causality in true experiments. That is, you can say if you see changes in the DV, they were caused by the independent variable. So you can study how randomly assigned sleep deprivation, for example, affects people's memory. And you could say it caused changes in memory if you find a difference. You can randomly assign them to a type of therapy and measure its effect on phobia. Some folks get, the normal treatment, some get the experimental treatment, and if you get a difference, you would assume it's due to the therapy. It's caused by the type of therapy. So then quasi-experiments are where you determine how DVs differ as a function of IVs. That is, I'm not saying it's causally related, but they do differ as a function of this other variable. So to be a quasi-experiment, all you have to do is have one or more quasi-independent variables. That is, one or more variables, independent variables that is not manipulated, assigned, or changed by the researcher. You just measured them how they were in their existing state. So if you got a study with one true IV and one quasi-experimental variable, you've got a quasi-experiment. So, for example, you could compare wrestlers and non-wrestlers. That would be your levels of an independent variable on their bulimia-related symptomology or behaviors, which is actually a study we analyze later on in the course. We're not assigning people to be wrestlers and non-wrestlers. We're measuring in them how they are. We're also just measuring bulimia behaviors because that's the dependent variable. We could look at how aggression changes as a function of child age. Again, you're not going to assign people age. Good luck if you could do that. Like, I would love to be in your shoes. We're just measuring how people age and at different ages what their aggression levels are. So the DV here is aggression. The independent variable is the age of the child. So the goal of experimental studies, not surprisingly, is to study experimental effects. So let's apply that. Let's see if we can do this. For each of the following questions, determine, can this question be tested scientifically? Yes, no. If so, what is the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? And would this likely be a true or a quasi-experiment? That's based on the independent variable. Can you ethically or in reality manipulate it, or are you just measuring it? Do infants dream? So is this scientifically testable? I don't think so. So, I mean, this is one that, students sometimes argue on. So I put a little explanation here. So we can measure behaviors in adults that they experience when they're dreaming, like REM, right? If we see those same behaviors in infants, we might think they're dreaming, but do we know they're dreaming? We have to infer they're dreaming, right? And so we actually, we don't know if infants dream, or your dog, or anything that can't report to you. So that one is not subject to the scientific method. Do college students who complete more courses have more efficient study habits? Is that testable scientifically? Yeah, sure is. So our independent variable here is the number of completed courses, right? That we want to know, or that's the thing that, again, we're not randomly assigning it. I guess I just gave that away. But we're measuring how many courses they completed, and then we're going to somehow measure their study habits as well and see if the latter differs as a function of number of courses. So the efficiency of their study habits is indeed the dependent variable in this study. So true or quasi-experiment? Well, it's quasi, right? Why? Because we are just measuring how many courses college students completed and seeing if their study habits vary as a function of it. So we would need to operationally define the number of completed courses, like, what is sort of more versus less courses completed. And we got to come up with some way to measure efficiency of study habits, but this is totally scientifically testable. Does caffeine make people anxious? Is that subject to the scientific method? You bet. Sure is. So our independent variable in this study is caffeine level. So we think that caffeine level has an effect on anxiety. So what is our DV? Anxiety. That's what we're measuring to see if caffeine had an effect. Can we randomly assign people to different caffeine levels? Yeah, we sure can. So if you randomly assign them to caffeine levels, it would be a true experiment, right? If you somehow just measured how many people, or how much caffeine people get from their daily visits to Starbucks, that would be a quasi-experiment. But I'm assuming it could be a true experiment, so I'm going there. Again, you need to operationally define what are the caffeine dosages, what's the anxiety level, how are you going to measure anxiety level, how are you going to operationalize it. Are our dreams an indication of our unconscious desires and conflicts? Is this scientifically testable? Is this one that we're going to take to the bank? No, it's just not, right? So this is not subject to the scientific method. So how are we supposed to objectively measure people's unconscious desires and conflicts? Like how are we supposed to be measuring those things? So next one. Is psychotherapy more beneficial than psychiatric medication for depressed clients? Is this something we could test scientifically? Yeah, we sure could, right? In fact, it's one we want to test scientifically because we want to know these things. This is being a good clinical psychologist. So the independent variable here is the type of mental health intervention. That would be psychotherapy versus medication. You might have one where both those things are crossed, right? The DB, the thing that we think is affected by psychotherapy or psychiatric medication is depression levels. So could we randomly assign folks to receive psychotherapy versus meds? I think we could, yeah. So I'm going to say true experiment. So again, we still got to operationally define stuff. What type of psychotherapy are we going to be using? And then what type of medication? And then how are we going to be measuring the benefit of those things on depression, the DV? Are some people born evil? I know you've wondered this, right? Is this subject to the scientific method? No, it's not something we're going to be anytime soon anyway, testing scientifically, okay? So how are you going to know if a newborn's evil, right? How are you going to be testing that? You know, maybe in the future they're going to be able to measure some sort of gene or biomarker associated with evilness, but like as of right now, we're not going to know if people are born evil or they're just sort of made evil. How about does memory get worse in old age? Is this subject to the scientific method? You bet your bottom it is. So we could test this. What's the IV? Well, the IV is the thing that we think affects the other. We think age, or we think, sorry, differs. The one variable differs as a function of. We think that memory differs as a function of old age. So old age is our independent variable. Okay, age, whatever, you get the drift. And then what do we think varies as a function of age? Well, we think memory differs as a function of age. So that's our DV. So are we randomly assigning people to be old or not? I no, right? This is a clear quasi-experiment. We're just measuring people how they are and looking at their memory. So again, the usual sort of disclaimer, we got to operationally define what's old age. It keeps getting older for me anyway. So what type of memory and how are we going to measure it, etc. So final slide is about that assignment I promised earlier, the IB-DV assignment, where your job is for, gosh, there's 196, almost 100 little study blurbs, titles, conclusions, things like that. And this is your job anyway, is to what's the independent variable or variables, because it can be more than one. What's the dependent variable or variables? And then is this likely to be a true or a quasi experiment? And so just to reiterate my earlier point, being able to pick out what are the variables and then what's the IV, what's the DV, and is this a true or quasi experiment is so important for your success, not only in this course, but in your dissertation and your future, that I just make you do lots and lots and lots of it until you finally get it. So it's like the equivalent in this class of times tables. So this is an assignment that is out there for you to complete, and you're going to do it in two parts. So let's do a couple of these together. So example one, does student satisfaction vary with course grades? What is the independent variable in there? Well, the independent variable is the thing that we think differs as a function of the other thing, right? And we think student satisfaction varies as a function of course grades. So our independent variable is course grades. Our dependent variable is satisfaction. Yeah, I forgot about that. So I recommend doing the dependent variable first because I just teaching this long enough that it seems like students are better able to get the DV and then figure out what the independent variable is. So are we randomly assigning students to grades? No, that's not happening. We're not. That would be not nice, as my wife would say. So example 2, we're going to do DV first this time. Which of the 4 different methods of teaching fractions to 5th graders facilitates the greatest comprehension? Okay, so what are we measuring here because we think it's affected by the other variable? Well, we're measuring comprehension, right, for fractions apparently. Sounds boring. And so our dependent variable here is comprehension for fractions. Our independent variable is apparently we think comprehension varies as a function of 4 different teaching methods. So I'm going to go for a teaching method. Boom. Can we randomly assign these children to the different types of teaching methods? Yeah, we actually could, right? We could go in to a school and randomly assign this particular learning module to kids where they get different methods. So this could be a true experiment. Next one, are there differences in self-confidence for female adults who adhere to an exercise programs, lovely grammar, and adult females who drop out of exercise programs? First of all, everyone in this study is a female, right? So female is not a variable. So drop that one out. That's not an IV or a DV. So what are we measuring here because we think it differs as a function of the other variable? Well, we're measuring self-confidence, right? So our dependent variable is self-confidence. And we think self-confidence varies as a function of what? Well, whether they adhere to their program, right? Their exercise program, I guess, or not, right? So our independent variable is the thing we're measuring here because we think self-confidence differs as a function of it. So our independent variable is program adherence. Are we randomly assigning women to stick with their exercise program or not? I doubt it. So probably a quasi-experiment. Do high school students who get computer-activated phone call messages when they are absent have better subsequent attendance than those who do not get messages? Lord, okay, it's a big long one. So what's going on in this one? Well, we got groups of high school students. Some are getting a phone call and some aren't, right? And what are we measuring because we think it's affected by that? Well, we're measuring their subsequent attendance, right? So the thing we're measuring because we think it's affected by the other one is attendance, subsequent attendance, fine. And we think subsequent attendance varies as a function of whether they got this call or not. We got to come up with some sort of name for got the call or didn't. I'm going to say type of or message status, or I don't know what I call it. Yeah, I did. Message status. Whether you yes, no, I guess, or electronic or none or something like that. Could we randomly assign high school kids to get the message or not? I think we could. So can we do it sort of ethically? I don't know, but I don't think this would be too unethical. So I'm guessing it's probably true. So gave that one away. So how about do 8th graders whose writing is evaluated by peers differ in their attitudes towards writing from those who are given teacher feedback? All right, well, we think in this particular one, their attitudes towards writing vary as a function of who they get their feedback from. So attitudes towards writing is going to be our dependent variable. And then we think that attitudes towards writing function differs as a function of who you got feedback. So I'm going for type of feedback, evaluator type. Okay, both are fine. Just so you guys know, there is no one name for these things. I mean, I wrote these, and I'm coming up with different names on the fly. But you do have to come up with a name for that covers all the categories. Don't name the categories. So could we randomly assign 8th graders to get feedback from their peers or teacher feedback? I think we could. So I'm going to call that a true experiment. So do school children who enter kindergarten at age 5 versus 6 have worse reading and math achievement? This one's a little tricky. So Yeah, let's start with the dB. So what's being measured here, because we think it varies as a function of the other variables? Well, there are two things, right? There is both reading achievement and math achievement. So this study has two DVs. And we think reading and math achievement vary as a function of what? The age that they started kindergarten, right? The levels of which are 5 or 6. So we have to say kindergarten start age, school start age, survey says age, whatever. All those, all those are perfectly acceptable answers, right? As long as you, like, I care much less that you get the exact term I use. I just need you to come up with a term, right? That's reasonable. So when in doubt, I throw status or type on the end of something. So like evaluator type, for example. So are we randomly assigning kids to start at 5th or 6th grade? I seriously doubt it. So this can be a quasi-experiment. So finally, this is a little study. These are also in the 96. This is the citation. So Solomon, 96, impact of motivational climate on students' behaviors and perceptions in a physical education setting. All right. So this is as vague as it gets. So what's being measured here, because we think it varies? Well, everyone's in physical ed. So everyone's in PE. So that's not a variable here. So knock that out. So we've got motivational climate, we've got behaviors and perceptions. What are we measuring because we think it's affected by the other one? Well, this has the word impact in it, right? So we think that motivational climate impacts two things. There are two DVs in this study, their behaviors and their perceptions. And what do we think the behaviors and perceptions differ as a function of? Motivational climate. Right, so that's our independent variable. Are we randomly assigning folks to different motivational climates? I mean, maybe, right? The way I conceptualize it, you could say, you're getting this type of like some sort of reinforcement thing or whatnot, and you guys aren't. They're trying things out. So that is the independent and dependent variables assignment. You complete it in two parts. You do the first 50, and then I sort of check in. I have an office hour on Wednesday. And then there's discussion. So make sure if you have questions, like you're not getting this, you hit the discussion, get some help from your classmates, and we'll talk. I also have my office hour. We'll talk, and it is really really important that you get these concepts. So after Wednesday, you got it down. Argue with your classmates online. Go ahead and finish it, do the remaining 46 or whatever it is. So that is the independent and dependent variable assignment.